Ilara Vance stood on the crest of the hill, where the wind never seemed to rest, a place where the sky felt too large and the earth too hard. Before her, a skeleton of gray stone clawed at the pewter clouds. It was what remained of the old barn, the last and only piece of a life that had been dismantled thread by thread. Her husband Thomas was gone, taken by a fever that had swept through the valley like a phantom thief in the night. The farm they had worked, the small white house with the blue shutters, the fields that had held their sweat and their hopes, all of it had been sold to settle debts that had grown like insidious weeds in the dark. All that was left to her name was this: a collapsing structure on a worthless parcel of land her mother had owned, a place the locals called the Wind's Anvil, because of the way the gales hammered it relentlessly, year after year. She had inherited it, a final, almost cruel joke from a life that had run out of punchlines. She had wept when the lawyer had handed her the deed. Wept not from sentimental attachment, but from the sheer, crushing weight of its uselessness. A crumbling stone barn on 2 acres of rock-strewn pasture that couldn't even grow stubborn thistle properly. Her brother-in-law, Marcus, a man whose heart was as practical and unyielding as a block of granite, had overseen the final transactions. He had presented her the papers with a look that mingled pity with a kind of grim satisfaction. He had always thought his brother had married beneath him, choosing a dreamer who saw poetry in cloud formations instead of a woman who understood crop rotation and profit margins. Here now was the proof of that folly. Ilara Vance, widow, 34 years old, with calloused hands, a hollowed-out look in her eyes, and the deed to a ruin. That first day, she walked the perimeter of her inheritance, the dry grass crunching under her worn boots. The wind was a physical presence, a bully that pushed and pulled at her worn coat, whispering of the coming winter with a bitter chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The barn itself was a testament to stubbornness. Its walls were 3 feet thick, built from massive, irregular stones hauled from the fields by men and mules a century ago. But time and the ceaseless wind had worked their patient destruction. The roof was a jagged mouth of broken timbers, open to the sky. One wall had begun to bow inward, a slow-motion surrender. Moss grew in the shaded crevices, and a hardy, tenacious ivy was methodically pulling the mortar from between the stones. People in the town of Havenwood, nestled in the valley below, thought she was mad to even consider it. They had seen her walking the hill, a solitary figure against the vast, uncaring sky, and the whispers had begun. The poor Vance widow. Lost her husband, and now her mind. Inside, the air was thick with the ghosts of forgotten labor, the scent of ancient hay, dry rot, and the damp mineral smell of the earth itself. Pigeons had claimed the high rafters as their own, their soft cooing a mournful counterpoint to the wind's howl. Sunlight streamed through the skeletal roof in shifting columns, illuminating dancing motes of dust. In the center of the vast earthen floor was a dark, square hole, covered by a few rotten planks of wood. It was the entrance to the old root cellar. Ilara remembered her mother talking about it, a place dug deep into the bedrock of the hill, a cold larder that kept potatoes firm and apples crisp through the harshest winters. It was the one part of the barn that had defied the decay above. She knelt, her knees protesting on the cold ground, and pulled away the splintered wood. A wave of cool, still air, smelling of deep earth and stone, rose to meet her. It was a different world down there, a world without wind. She found a rusted lantern in a corner, miraculously still holding a bit of oil, and with trembling hands managed to coax a weak, flickering flame to life. She descended the steep stone steps, each one worn into a smooth hollow by generations of use. The cellar was larger than she had imagined, a cavern of hand-hewn stone that extended far beyond the barn's footprint. The walls were damp to the touch, but not wet. The air was profoundly still and held a constant, deep chill that felt ancient and absolute. It was the cold of the Earth's core, a temperature set not by the season or the sun, but by the sheer mass of the planet. She held the lantern high, its light glinting off veins of quartz in the rock. And it was in that moment, standing in the silent subterranean cold, that the first seed of an idea, an impossible, desperate, and utterly mad idea, began to germinate in the barren soil of her mind. She thought of the wind upstairs, the relentless, energy-sapping, soul-crushing wind, and then she thought of the stillness here, the absolute, unwavering peace of the deep earth. The world above was a place of violent extremes. The summers in this region could be brutally hot, the sun a merciless hammer that baked the ground to cracked clay. The winters were the stuff of legend, bringing waves of Arctic air that could freeze a man's breath in his lungs and bury the world under feet of snow. Life was a constant battle against the elements, a costly war waged with firewood, insulation, and fortitude. But down here, in the heart of the hill, the war was already over. The earth was not fighting the seasons. It was simply ignoring them. She placed her hand against the cold stone wall. It was a constant, a stable, predictable, and powerful force. Everyone looked at the barn and saw a ruin being torn apart by the sky. She was suddenly looking at it and seeing an anchor, a gateway to a place that the sky could not touch. She climbed back up the steps, her heart beating a little faster. The wind howled through the broken roof, a familiar torment. But now she heard it differently. It was not a personal attack, but simply a fact of the surface. A problem to be solved, not endured. Her plan began to take shape, not as a detailed blueprint, but as a feeling, a conviction. She wouldn't try to rebuild the barn to fight the wind. That was a fool's errand, a battle that had already been lost. Instead, she would go down. She would hollow out a life for herself beneath the ruin, using the collapsing stone walls not as a shelter, but as a shell, a protective carapace over the entrance to her true home. She would live in the earth, like a badger in its set, warm in the winter and cool in the summer, shielded from the tyranny of the sky. The people of Havenwood would call her the Mole Woman. She knew this with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the cellar stone, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she found she did not care. The next day, she went to town. Havenwood was a place built on convention, on the hard-won wisdom of generations who had learned how to survive in this unforgiving landscape. Her appearance at Silas Croft's hardware store caused a minor stir. Silas was a man whose face was a roadmap of the local weather, creased and weathered, but his eyes were kind. He had known Thomas. He looked at Alara with a practiced sympathy. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble. "What can I get for you?" She handed him a small, carefully written list. A heavy-duty shovel, a pickaxe, a wheelbarrow with a solid rubber tire, rope, a dozen thick tallow candles, and a sturdy bucket. Silas looked at the list, then back at her. He didn't ask what she was building. He didn't need to. The whole town knew she was living. Camping, really, in the ruin on the hill. He saw the grim set of her jaw, the unwavering focus in her eyes that bordered on mania. "That's a lot of digging for one person," he said, his tone gentle, probing. "Just shoring up the foundation before the ground freezes," she replied, her voice flat, offering no room for argument. It was not a complete lie. He nodded slowly, the skepticism plain on his face, but he gathered her items. He represented the town's conventional wisdom, a practicality that bordered on pessimism. As he loaded the wheelbarrow, he added a pair of thick leather work gloves. "On the house," he said quietly. "Your hands will thank you." It was a gesture of pity, not of faith, and Alara knew it. Her brother-in-law, Marcus, caught her on the path back up the hill. He pulled his truck over, the engine a low growl of expensive machinery that stood in stark contrast to her dusty, manual existence. He was a thick, solid man who looked like he had been carved from the same stubborn oak as his new farmhouse. "Alara," he said, not getting out of the truck, forcing her to stand on the road like a beggar. "What is all this?" He gestured with his chin toward the wheelbarrow. "I'm making the barn habitable," she said. He let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound like a stone cracking. "Habitable? It's a pile of rocks. The wind will take the rest of it down this winter. You should be in town, finding a room to rent. There's work at the diner." He saw her as a problem to be managed, a loose end from his brother's life that needed to be neatly tied up. A liability. "I have a place to live," she said, her grip tightening on the handles of the wheelbarrow. "Don't be a fool," he snapped, his patience gone. "You're embarrassing the family name, living up here like some wild animal. People are talking. They're saying you've gone mad with grief." "Let them talk," Alara said, and she turned and began pushing the heavy wheelbarrow up the steep, rutted track, not looking back. She could feel his glare on her back, a mixture of anger and disgust. The confrontation solidified her resolve. His mockery was just another form of wind, something to be endured and ignored. The work began. It was a slow, brutal, and methodical process. Her world shrank to the circle of lantern light in the cellar, to the sound of her own breathing, the rhythmic scrape of the shovel, and the dull thud of the pickaxe against compacted earth and stone. She was not just digging, she was carving, hollowing out a space from the unyielding grip of the hill. The first task was to deepen and widen the existing cellar. Every bucket of dirt and rock had to be hauled up the stone steps and dumped outside, where the wind immediately began to scatter it. Her body, soft from years of farm wife duties, rebelled. Her back screamed in protest. Her hands, even with Silas's gloves, blistered, bled, and then hardened into thick, clumsy pads of callus. There were days when exhaustion was a physical weight, so heavy she could barely lift herself from her bedroll. In those moments of despair, she would simply go and stand at the cellar entrance, feeling the cool, still air on her face, and remember why she was doing it. She was not building a house. She was building a sanctuary. She learned the language of the earth. She discovered layers of clay, perfect for mixing with straw to create a kind of plaster for the walls. She found seams of shale that she could split into rough, flat tiles for a floor. The hill itself was her hardware store, her lumber yard. She worked with a quiet, focused intensity, a process-oriented determination that left no room for doubt. She was not thinking about the winter, or Marcus, or the town. She was thinking only of the next shovelful, the next stone to be moved, the next small, incremental victory against the inertia of the planet. She devised a simple pulley system using the old hayloft beam that still spanned the barn's width, allowing her to haul larger rocks out of the deepening excavation. It was slow, back-breaking engineering, but it worked. Silas would sometimes drive his truck up the track, ostensibly to check on a fence line nearby, but she knew he was checking on her. He'd watch her for a few minutes, a lone woman wrestling with physics and geology, and shake his head before driving away. He never offered to help. Her project was too far outside the realm of his practical understanding. To him it was a profound, tragic folly, and he was merely a witness to it. As autumn deepened, the days grew shorter and the wind sharpened its teeth. The whispers in town grew louder. They called her the Quarry Witch, the Mole Woman. Children would dare each other to run up the hill and peek into the ruin, scrambling away with frightened laughter. They saw a woman covered in dirt, her hair matted, her clothes patched and worn. They saw madness. They did not see the meticulous work happening beneath their feet. They did not see the space she was creating, a series of interconnected chambers branching off the main cellar. A sleeping alcove, a food storage area, a main living space with a floor of carefully laid shale. She had even channeled a tiny, persistent seep of groundwater into a stone-lined basin, giving her a source of fresh, cold water. The most crucial piece of her design was the chimney. She spent a month building it, a masterpiece of scavenged stone and clay mortar that snaked its way up through the earth and exited discreetly through a collapsed section of the barn wall, looking like little more than a pile of rocks. It was a low, wide flue, designed for a small, efficient stove she had salvaged from a collapsed outbuilding. Its purpose was not just for heat, but for air circulation, drawing fresh air down a second, hidden shaft. Marcus came one last time before the first snow. He found her outside, splitting a small pile of wood she had painstakingly gathered. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "The town council is talking about having you removed, Alara. For your own safety. They can't have you freezing to death on town land." "It's my land," she said, not pausing her work. The axe fell with a satisfying thwack. "It's a public hazard," he fumed. "And you're a disgrace, living in a hole in the ground. What would Thomas say?" That stung. A flicker of pain crossed her face, and he saw it, pressing his advantage. He would be ashamed. He would want you safe, in a proper house, not this. He gestured vaguely at the ruin. "This is my house," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "And it will be safer than yours when the White Death comes." He stared at her. The White Death was a local term for the once-a-decade blizzard that swept down from the north, a storm of such ferocity that it became a marker in time, a way of dating births and deaths. "Don't be ridiculous," he scoffed. "My house was built last year. Best insulation, triple-pane windows, a generator the size of a small car. I'll be warmer than a bear in its den. You'll be a frozen corpse in a ditch." He turned and left, the finality of his words hanging in the cold air. The deal was done. The lines had been drawn. The first snows were light, a gentle dusting that turned the world quiet and soft. Alara made her final preparations. She moved her supplies, her bedroll, her small store of dried goods and preserves, into her subterranean home. The last thing she moved was a small rocking chair that had belonged to her mother. She placed it near the stone hearth. Lighting the small stove for the first time was a moment of profound, quiet triumph. The flue drew perfectly, pulling the smoke up and away. A slow, gentle warmth began to radiate through the stone-lined room, a deep, penetrating heat that the wind could not steal. The air remained fresh and clean, circulating through her ingenious hidden vents. She sat in the rocking chair, listening to the crackle of the fire. Above, through the open roof of the barn, she could hear the wind beginning to pick up, a low moan that was steadily rising in pitch. But down here, in the heart of the hill, there was only the sound of the fire and the steady, quiet beat of her own heart. She was ready. The storm arrived not as a squall, but as an invasion. The sky, which had been a flat, metallic gray for days, seemed to descend, to merge with the land in a swirling chaos of white. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed. It was a physical force that scoured the landscape, ripping shingles from roofs in the valley below, shattering windows, and piling snow into monstrous, impassable drifts. The radio called it the storm of the century. In Havenwood, people huddled in their homes, listening to the roar, the house timbers groaning under the strain. The power grid, burdened by the demand and assaulted by the wind, failed on the first night. The town was plunged into darkness, and a terrifying, howling silence broken only by the sound of the gale. In his state-of-the-art farmhouse, Marcus felt the first tremor of unease when the lights went out. He switched on his generator, and the house hummed back to life, a bubble of technological defiance against the storm. He felt a smug satisfaction. He thought of Alara in her pile of rocks and shook his head. But the storm was relentless. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero, then 40. The wind drove the cold into every tiny crack and crevice of his well-built house. The generator, running constantly, burned through fuel at an alarming rate. By the second day, a new, more sinister sound joined the storm's chorus. The groaning, and then the sharp crack of a frozen pipe bursting in the wall. Soon, another followed. Water, his home's lifeblood, became its enemy, freezing and expanding with irresistible force. His modern marvel of a house was beginning to break. By the third day, the generator sputtered and died. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the storm's roar. The cold, no longer held at bay, seeped into the house, a palpable predatory presence. The temperature inside began to drop, degree by agonizing degree. Alara, meanwhile, was not just surviving, she was comfortable. In her earthen home, the temperature held at a steady, comfortable 60 degrees. The stone walls, warmed by her small, efficient stove, radiated a gentle, even heat. The earth around her, a massive, unmoving insulator, cared nothing for the 40-below blizzard, raging just a few feet above. The wind could shriek and tear at the barn, but its fury could not penetrate the ground. She cooked a simple stew on her stovetop, the smell of herbs and broth filling her small, cozy space. She read an old book by candlelight, the silence of the deep earth a comforting blanket. She was utterly disconnected from the violent chaos on the surface, an island of calm in a sea of meteorological rage. The world could end up there, and she would never know. She felt a profound sense of security, a feeling she had not known since before Thomas had fallen ill. It was a security born not of thick walls and modern technology, but of a simple, profound understanding of the natural world. She had not fought the environment. She had made a partnership with it. For Marcus, the situation had become desperate. The house was now dangerously cold, the air thick with the frost of his own breath. His wife and 2 small children were huddled under every blanket they owned, their faces pale with fear and cold. Pride warred with terror. To admit defeat, to seek help from the mad woman on the hill, was unthinkable. But the thought of his children, their small bodies shivering uncontrollably, was a more powerful force than his pride. He had to do something. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he possessed and stepped out into the storm. It was like stepping onto another planet. The wind knocked him flat, and the air was so cold it felt like breathing shards of glass. He could not see more than 5 feet in front of him. The world was a blinding, roaring whiteness. He knew the way to the old barn by instinct, by the memory of the land in his bones. He stumbled and fell, crawling on his hands and knees when the wind was too strong to stand, the snow piling up against his body. It was a primal, desperate journey. A man stripped of all his modern certainties, reduced to a crawling animal fighting for survival. He finally reached the ruin, a dark shape barely visible in the maelstrom. The barn was half filled with a massive snowdrift, the wind shrieking through its broken timbers. It looked like a place of death, an abandoned, frozen tomb. For a moment his heart sank. He had been a fool. Of course she was dead. No one could survive this. But then he saw it. A thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke, snatched away instantly by the wind, but undeniably there, rising from a nondescript pile of rocks near the leaning wall. And he could feel, even through his thick boots, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth radiating from the ground. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through him. He scrambled toward the dark opening of the barn, shouting her name, his voice swallowed by the storm. He stumbled down the old cellar steps, falling the last few feet into the entryway, and lay there, gasping, his body shaking, his eyes blinded by the sudden transition from raging white to soft, warm light. When his vision cleared, he saw her. She was sitting in a rocking chair by a small glowing stove, a book in her lap. The room was warm, dry, and filled with the gentle, flickering light of several candles. It was a scene of such impossible peace, such profound and utter tranquility, that his mind struggled to comprehend it. It was a burrow, a den, a womb carved into the heart of the world. He saw the neatly stacked firewood, the shelves of preserved food, the stone basin of clear water. He saw a home. Ilara looked up from her book, her expression unreadable. She was not surprised. She had, in some way, been expecting him. He pushed himself to his feet, snow melting off his clothes and puddling on the stone floor. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand, to explain, but the words died in his throat. What could he say? He looked at his own frost-bitten hands, at the state-of-the-art winter gear that had failed him, at the memory of his freezing multi-million-dollar house. Then he looked at her in her simple wool sweater, in her warm, quiet, impossible sanctuary. He saw not a madwoman, but an architect of survival, a genius. All the mockery, the condescension, the arrogant certainty drained out of him, leaving him hollow and humbled. He stood there, shivering, defeated by a simple truth he had been too blind to see. He finally managed one word, his voice a raw, broken whisper. How? Ilara closed her book, marking her page with a finger. She looked at him, not with triumph, not with malice, but with a quiet, weary understanding. You tried to fight the winter, she said, her voice calm and even. I just got out of its way. She stood and ladled a cup of hot stew from the pot on the stove. She handed it to him. The warmth seeped into his frozen fingers, a small act of grace that felt monumental. The deal was done. The argument was over. She was right. When the storm finally broke after 5 long days, the world that emerged was shattered and frozen. The valley of Havenwood was a scene of devastation. Dozens of homes had suffered burst pipes and structural damage. The town's livestock had been decimated. 2 elderly men living in isolated cabins had been found frozen to death. The cost of the White Death was measured in money, in loss, and in a newfound respect for the raw power of nature. But on the hill, when the sun finally emerged, casting a brilliant, blinding light on the new-formed landscape of snow, all was well. Marcus, after retrieving his family and bringing them to the impossible warmth of Ilara's burrow, had become her unwitting disciple. The story of their survival, and of the source of their salvation, spread through the thawing town like wildfire. At first, there was disbelief, but the evidence was undeniable. Marcus Vance, the most practical and progressive farmer in the valley, a man who believed in technology and engineering above all else, was now a convert to the gospel of his mad sister-in-law. He told anyone who would listen about the steady, quiet warmth of her underground home, about the simple genius of its design. The perception of Ilara shifted with the speed of a spring thaw. She was no longer the quarry witch or the mole woman. The name they gave her now was spoken with a kind of hushed awe. They called her the Barrow Wife. Her folly was now seen as wisdom, her madness as foresight. Silas Croft was one of the first to come up the hill, his face a mixture of shame and wonder. He looked at the simple, effective construction, at the way she had worked with the land instead of against it. "I'll be damned," he muttered, running a hand over the smooth, clay-plastered wall. "All these years, we've been building higher and thicker, trying to keep the cold out. You just ducked." He looked at her, his eyes full of a new and profound respect. Could you show me how?" And so the aftermath of the storm became the beginning of a new chapter for both Ilara and for Havenwood. She did not become a recluse or a hermit. She became a teacher. With Silas's help providing materials and Marcus's providing labor and legitimacy, she helped other families build their own storm cellars, their own barrows. It was not a replacement for their homes, but a vital addition, a sanctuary against the inevitable fury of the next White Death. Her method, once an object of scorn, became the new standard, a piece of local wisdom passed down. She never moved from her home in the hill. She expanded it over the years, adding a small glassed-in greenhouse on the south-facing side of the barn ruin. using the same geothermal principles to grow fresh vegetables year-round. She lived a long, quiet, and secure life, a woman who had found her strength not in fighting the world, but in understanding it. She had listened to the whisper of the deep earth when everyone else was shouting at the wind. Years later, long after Alara Vance was laid to rest beside her husband, the barrows of Havenwood were still there, small, grassy mounds behind the farmhouses, their stone-lined entrances a testament to the woman who had dared to look down instead of up. Her story became a local legend, a cautionary tale about the arrogance of conventional thinking, and a celebration of the quiet power of observation. It serves as a reminder that the greatest value is often hidden beneath a surface of neglect and ruin. It speaks to the courage it takes to look foolish in the pursuit of a deeper wisdom, to trust an unconventional insight in the face of universal skepticism. What Alara inherited was not a crumbling barn, but an idea that the most profound solutions are often not about building stronger walls to keep the world out, but about finding the quiet center where the world's fury cannot reach. Her legacy was not built of stone and earth, but of a fundamental truth. Sometimes, to survive the storm, you must have the wisdom to go to ground.